Hello everyone, welcome to Creepytime Ghost Story channel, where we bring you real horror stories broadcast every day. Tonight, we travel to a place where the ground itself is alive, breathing heat, exhaling gas, and hiding memories that refuse to stay buried. Emily had heard of Centralia before, in the kind of half-whispered conversations that start with, "You wouldn't last an hour there after dark." She wasn't from around here, which was probably why she thought the warnings were more like campfire stories than actual advice. The truth was, Centralia didn't need legends to make it dangerous. The mine fire burning beneath the town had been raging since the 1962nd, swallowing streets, forcing families to leave, and turning a once bustling community into a ghost map. Of course, she'd come here right at sunset. Perfect timing. The sky was fading into that strange violet shade that makes the edges of things blur. A warm breeze carried the faint scent of burnt rubber mixed with something metallic, and the cracked asphalt under her sneakers radiated heat. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Emily muttered it like a joke to herself, pretending she was the one hosting her own eerie adventure series, and post where you're watching from and the time. Now, turn down the lights, turn on the fan for some soothing background music, and let's go on our journey tonight. The first law was easy enough to find if you knew where to look. No walking the graffiti highway alone. The locals didn't write it down anywhere, but they might as well have carved it into stone. The stretch of abandoned Route 61 was closed years ago, fenced off, and later buried under dirt to discourage visitors. But parts of it were still visible if you knew where the gaps in the earth were. And Emily had followed one such path from the edge of town. The surface was warped and broken, its cracks filled with dirt, weeds, and spray-painted layers of neon words and symbols. Some were jokes, some were declarations of love, and some were well less friendly. Emily trailed her fingers along the jagged asphalt, her footsteps echoing faintly in the stillness. The strange thing was how warm it felt, like the road itself had been baking in the sun all day, even though the evening air was already cooling. She'd read about the history. Memorial Day, 1,962 volunteer firefighters had set a small trash fire in the town's landfill, which happened to be over an old mine shaft. The flames reached the coal vein beneath, and that was it. The fire spread underground, unstoppable. By the late 1982nd, the government had declared the town unsafe, buying out homes, demolishing buildings. Almost everyone left. Almost. But Emily wasn't thinking about history right now. She was thinking about the sound she just heard. A faint pop under her feet, followed by a low hiss, like the ground had just released a breath. She froze, glancing around. The wind had died completely. That was when she remembered the true story her uncle once told her. A man just passing through decided to walk the graffiti highway at night. He thought it was empty, abandoned, but halfway in, he saw shapes ahead, human-shaped, unmoving. He turned to leave, but the road behind him was empty too, and he swore it had been longer a moment ago. When they found him the next morning, he was crouched by the guardrail, shivering, muttering that the faces wouldn't stop watching him. Do ghosts really exist? She whispered to herself. Or does a place like this just play tricks on your mind? Emily took another step forward and felt the ground shift ever so slightly. She crouched, touching the asphalt again, and that was when she saw its steam rising faintly from a hairline crack. It smelled faintly of sulfur. She could hear her own breathing now, a little too fast, echoing in the quiet. The thing about walking alone here wasn't just the heat or the shifting ground, it was how the silence seemed to thicken, wrapping around you until you couldn't tell if you were hearing something or just imagining it. She looked down the long, broken stretch ahead and thought she saw a dark shape too far to be clear, but not far enough to ignore. Her hand went instinctively to her phone, but she didn't take a picture. Instead, she slid it into her pocket, turned slowly, and began walking back toward the streetlights of the main road. The asphalt hissed behind her. The second rule wasn't printed on any sign, but every Centralia local who had stayed long enough to know the truth would tell you, never walk past the burned church at night. Emily hadn't planned to go there, but the cracked streets had a way of bending unexpectedly, curving toward places you didn't mean to see, and there it was, perched on a gentle hill, its brick walls darkened with soot, windows staring like hollow eyes. The steeple was still intact, its cross faintly silhouetted against the moonlight, but the building itself looked scorched. Not freshly, but in a way that made it seem older than the fire, like it had been forgotten decades before the mine ever caught flame. Emily slowed her pace, shifting her backpack slightly. The warm air from the ground had turned to a subtle chill here, as if she'd stepped out of one season into another. Her sneakers crunched on loose gravel, and somewhere in the stillness, she thought she heard a single note faint, almost like an organ key pressed in a far-off room. They say the church burned in 2073, when the underground fire finally reached its foundation. No one was inside, or at least no one living. The preacher had been buried out back years before, but people whispered that his sermons never stopped. Travelers claimed to hear voices when they passed at night, low, rhythmic, rising and falling in a language they didn't quite understand. Emily wasn't the superstitious type, but she never liked old churches, especially at night. Something about the way they seemed to hold sound differently, like the air inside was thicker. She walked on the opposite side of the road, keeping her eyes on the path ahead. That was when she heard it again, the faint organ note, only now joined by another, then another, forming a slow, deliberate melody. The tune was old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect in a funeral march. Emily stopped walking, her ears straining. The sound was clearer now, and it was coming from inside the burned church. She took one step closer, just enough to glance through the broken front door. Her phone's flashlight barely reached the far wall, but she saw it, a long wooden pew, blackened but still upright. And at the far end, something moved. Not a person exactly, but a pale shape, shifting just beyond the light. Emily's breath caught. She told herself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a stray dog, but then the melody stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the music. It was heavy, expectant, like the pause before a sentence you don't want to hear. Her instincts told her to leave, so she did quickly, without looking back. The gravel crunched louder under her feet, and every step seemed to echo off the empty houses on either side. When she reached the end of the block, she risked one last glance over her shoulder. The church door was still open, but the pale shape was gone. And then, faintly, the music began again. Centralia had rules about where you could walk, but the third rule was stranger than the rest. Never step onto the cracked football field after dark. Thomas Field, named after a local coach from the 1952nd, had been abandoned long before Emily was born. Once, it had been the pride of the high school, the kind of place where the whole town gathered on Friday nights. Now, it was just a scar in the earth, patchy grass, rusted bleachers, and a scoreboard whose numbers had long since peeled away. The goalposts leaned at odd angles, and the asphalt track around the field was broken into jagged segments. Emily first heard about the rule from an older man she met at the gas station outside town, He'd been one of the last people to play on that field before the fire spread beneath it. "It's not the smoke you should worry about," he'd said, voice low. "It's the people who still think they're playing." She thought he was joking until she saw it for herself. It was a warm night, and the mist was rising from the ground in ghostly wisps. She had cut across the edge of the field to save time, her sneakers crunching over the brittle grass. That's when she heard the faint sound of cheering. It was distant, like it came from an old recording, muffled but unmistakable. She froze, scanning the empty bleachers. They were empty, of course, but the sound swelled, and for a moment she could swear she heard a whistle blow, sharp and short. Emily stepped forward, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the moon. Out near the 50-yard line, the mist thickened, swirling into shapes she couldn't quite define. They moved with purpose, darting and weaving as if chasing something invisible. Then she saw it, a faint, glowing shape arcing through the air. It wasn't a football, not exactly. It was too bright, too smooth, like a ball made of light. The figures chased it, their movements eerily precise. Some wore uniforms tattered, discolored, with numbers barely visible. Their faces were pale blurs, but she could feel their focus, their determination to finish the game. She remembered the old man's words. "They still think they're playing." Emily backed up slowly, careful not to make a sound. But the moment her foot slipped on loose gravel, one of the figures turned. The blur of his face seemed to sharpen, eyes locking onto her. The glowing ball froze mid-air, the other stopping as if the whistle had blown again. The silence was immediate. The crowd noise vanished. The air grew heavy, pressing against her chest. Then, all at once, the glowing ball dropped to the ground and rolled toward her slowly, deliberately. She didn't wait to see what would happen if it reached her. She turned and ran, not stopping until she was 3 blocks away, lungs burning. When she finally dared to look back, the field was empty again. No figures, no ball, just mist curling lazily over the dead grass. And somewhere deep inside, she knew the game had never actually ended. The fourth law was more cryptic. Don't answer the payphone near the old post office after sunset. Emily didn't even know there was still a working payphone in Centralia until she saw it for herself. The post office had been boarded up for decades. Its faded red bricks now blackened in places from the creeping underground heat. Windows were covered with warped plywood, and weeds had forced their way through cracks in the steps. Yet there it was, bolted to the wall beside the entrance. A scratched metal payphone with a yellowed plastic receiver, hanging limply from its cord like a tired arm. Nobody ever used it during the day. One evening, Emily found herself walking that way purely out of curiosity. She'd been following a trail of warm air rising through the cracks in the sidewalk when the phone began to ring. It wasn't a normal, crisp ring. It was hollow, echoing, almost metallic, in a way that made her teeth ache. The sound came in bursts, ring, 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 slow and deliberate. She knew the rule. She also knew that most rules in this town had a reason you didn't want to discover. But the human brain doesn't always behave logically, and Emily found herself staring at the receiver, her hand inching forward. What if it's someone who needs help? She thought. What if it's nothing? The moment her fingers brushed the cold plastic, the ringing stopped. There was a hiss on the line, like wind rushing through a narrow tunnel. Then, faintly, a man's voice, calm, deliberate, and disturbingly close. "Emily," it said. Her stomach dropped. Nobody in town knew her name. Not really. Not unless they'd been told. She didn't speak. The voice chuckled softly. "You're not supposed to be here. It's after dark. go home before the fire breathes. The hiss grew louder, turning into something wetter, like boiling water. Emily slammed the receiver back into place, but the sound didn't stop. It was leaking from the payphone itself, vibrating through the metal. She stepped back, and that's when she saw it. The reflection in the cracked glass of the phone's coin return. A man in a postal worker's uniform stood behind her. His shirt was scorched, the edges still glowing faintly, as if amber burned. His face, what she could see of it, was blurred with heat distortion, features shifting like they were underwater. She spun around, but the street was empty. When she looked back at the payphone, the receiver was swinging gently, tapping against the metal casing with a hollow clink, clink, clink. The next day, she mentioned it to the owner of the diner on Route 61. The woman's expression hardened. "That phone hasn't been connected since 2083, she said. "Last call it ever made was to 911. Guy inside was trapped when the roof collapsed. They say his voice still looks for someone to pick up." Emily never walked past the post office again, not after dark. The fifth law was printed right at the bottom of the laminated list, in faded red ink. Do not walk along Route 61 when the moon is high. To anyone else, it might have sounded like an overly cautious traffic warning, but Emily already knew Route 61 here wasn't like any other road. The real highway had been rerouted decades ago. What remained through Centralia was an abandoned stretch of cracked asphalt, overgrown at the edges, with faded double yellow lines splitting down the middle like a scar that never healed right. They called it the graffiti highway now, though most of the spray paint was as old as Emily. Bright slogans and strange symbols covered the ground in layers, some playful, some unsettling. That night, the moon was almost full. Emily hadn't planned to break the law, it just happened. The shortcut from the diner to her temporary rental took her past the blocked-off entrance to the old road. And something about the silver light spilling over the crumbling asphalt pulled her in like a tide. It was silent except for the faint hiss of steam rising from the fractures in the ground. The moonlight caught on bits of broken glass, making the road glitter faintly as she walked. Then she noticed something strange. The painted messages under her feet began to change. At first, she thought it was a trick of shadow, the outlines bending, letters warping, but then she stopped dead in her tracks. The spray-painted phrase that had read "Live free" now said "Leave now." Her chest tightened. She glanced behind her, but the way back looked longer than it should have been, the shadows stretching unnaturally. That's when she heard the footsteps. They didn't echo. They didn't match hers. "Hello?" she called out, her voice too loud in the stillness. No answer. Just the sound of shoes dragging slowly along the painted surface. The old stories about Route 61 came back to her. People said the abandoned section was like a tape that played differently depending on who walked it. Some saw nothing but cracked road. Others swore they saw the night the fire began replayed in full. Men running, ash raining, the sky turning an impossible shade of orange. And some heard voices that knew exactly how they would die. Emily's pace quickened. The dragging footsteps behind her matched. She broke into a jog. They jogged. Her breath clouded in the cold air, except it wasn't that cold. The heat from below made the ground warm enough to seep through her shoes. Yet every time she exhaled, she could see her breath clearly. Finally, she reached the rusted barrier where the real highway began again. She turned, expecting something. The road was empty. But there, at her feet, someone had painted fresh words in dripping white. "Emily, the fire doesn't sleep." Her pulse hammered in her ears. She backed away, keeping her eyes on the writing until she reached the streetlight at the corner. The next morning, she asked one of the older men at the diner if anyone had been painting new graffiti lately. He shook his head slowly. "Moonlight changes it sometimes," he said. They say the road remembers names. The sixth law was the one Emily had secretly laughed at when she first read it. No talking to the children after dark. It wasn't that she disliked kids, it was just the wording. It sounded like something out of an old horror movie, the kind of warning a cryptic innkeeper would mutter before vanishing into the shadows. But in Centralia, even the absurd rules had weight. By now, Emily understood that weight. It was late when she heard them for the first time, light voices outside her rental, weaving through the hum of the furnace in the basement. The air was cool, but the warmth from the underground fires seeped through the floorboards, creating a strange contrast that made her restless. She cracked the window to let in fresh air. That's when she heard the giggle. It was high-pitched, playful. Another voice joined in the boy, maybe 10 years old, calling out something she couldn't quite make out. Emily glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. "Hey," she called softly into the night, forgetting the rule for just a moment. "Are you lost?" The voices stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a storm. Then, from somewhere deep in the dark, a single word floated back to her. "Number." It wasn't playful anymore. She shut the window and backed away, her heart pounding. The old stories came rushing back. Centralia's fire had displaced not just people, but memories. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski had fallen into a sinkhole that opened beneath his backyard. The heat and smoke had almost taken him before a relative pulled him out. The town never fully recovered from that day. Some swore that the children wandering after dark weren't really there. They were echoes, shapes of lives caught in a moment just before something terrible happened. The next evening, she walked past the empty playground on Locust Avenue. The swings swayed without wind. The metal slide, warped from decades of heat, gleamed dully in the last light of day. She didn't hear voices this time, but she felt watched like the ground beneath the jungle gym was breathing. A retired firefighter named Carl once told her the most unnerving night of his career happened right here. He'd been on patrol after reports of kids trespassing on the unstable ground. He'd spotted a group of them running between the swings, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight. But when he reached the fence, the playground was empty, and the footprints in the dust were small, perfect, except they led straight toward a crack in the earth where no child could have stood. Emily didn't laugh at the rule anymore. She began avoiding the sound of young voices after dark, keeping her blinds strong, her lights low. Still, every so often, she'd hear that same giggle. It never came from the street, always from the yard, always close to the window, and she never, ever looked. By now, Emily thought she'd gotten used to the strange rhythm of Centralia nights, furnace heat bleeding from the ground, the faint smell of sulfur, voices that didn't belong to the living. But the seventh law was different. It wasn't about something you might accidentally stumble into. It was about a choice. Never light a fire outdoors after sunset. The warning seemed almost laughable. At first, this was a town sitting on top of a fire that had been burning for over 60 years. What difference could a little campfire make? That was until she heard about the McClellan incident. It had happened in the early 2002. A family from out of state, 2 parents, their teenage son, and his girlfriend decided to spend the evening roasting marshmallows outside the old McClellan property. The lot was nothing but cracked asphalt and weeds now, but they'd set up a folding chair circle like it was a normal campsite. According to the lone surviving family member, everything was fine until the smoke from their small fire began to drift straight down into the ground. The moment it disappeared into the cracked soil, the air shifted. The ground around them started to pulse with heat, not gradually, but in a sudden, suffocating wave. The girlfriend had screamed, claiming she saw faces in the smoke curling back up toward them. The father had thrown dirt on the fire, but it was too late. By morning, only the son was found wandering Route 61 barefoot, unable to explain why his family never came back from the circle of chairs. Emily thought about that story as she sat on her porch one evening, sipping weak coffee and watching the last light drain from the horizon. A few houses down, she saw an orange flicker. Someone, maybe a new visitor, had lit a small fire pit. At first, nothing happened. Then the wind died. The smoke stopped rising. She could almost feel the ground drawing it in, like a living thing inhaling deeply. And then, faintly, she saw them shapes in the haze, not quite faces, but impressions of grief. Like the earth itself remembered every person it had taken. In the years since the mine fire began in 1962, geologists had argued over how deep the burning tunnels really went. Some claimed it could burn for another century. Others said parts of it might already be reaching cooler stone. But locals like Carl, the retired firefighter, believed the fire wasn't just heat and carbon monoxide. They said it had moods, and it didn't like competition. Emily stayed still, holding her breath, as the fire down the street sputtered out on its own. The orange glow faded, swallowed by the blackness of Centralia's night. The next morning, the lot was empty. No fire pit, no chairs, no trace that anyone had been there at all. Emily didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She knew the town had a way of enforcing its rules without ever raising its voice. The final law Emily had been warned about wasn't written on any faded sign or muttered in passing by the older residents. It was spoken in a whisper, the kind you almost couldn't hear unless the speaker wanted you to. Never answer your name if you're here after dark. By now, Emily had learned not to laugh at rules like that. But still, there was a stubborn part of her, the part that used to live in the city and believe every sound could be explained, that wondered why simply hearing your name could be dangerous. Then she heard the story of Franklin Dawes. Franklin had been a mail carrier before the evacuation orders in the 1982nd. He stayed behind when nearly everyone else left, claiming he knew the town better than anyone and that nothing could scare him off his own property. One summer evening, as the fire glowed faintly under the street, Franklin had been in his backyard fixing a bent section of fence. That's when he heard someone calling, "Franklin." The voice was warm, familiar, almost exactly like his late wife's. Neighbors later said they watched him stand up, brush off his hands, and start walking toward the tree line without hesitation. When they called after him, he didn't respond. He just kept walking, disappearing into the shadows between two scorched maple trees. They never found him. Some people in Centralia say that the voice that calls you is the town itself testing you, luring you toward places where the ground is hollow and the air is poison. Others believe it's something older, something that feeds on recognition. On that moment, your mind relaxes when you hear someone you love. Emily had her first encounter with it on a night when the cicadas had gone strangely silent. She was locking her front door when she heard it, Emily drawn out, like whoever said it was smiling. It was the exact voice of her brother Mark, who lived 3 states away. She froze. Every instinct screamed to answer, but the rules she'd memorized weighed heavier. Instead, she stepped back, bolted the lock, and turned on every light in the house. The voice didn't call again. Later, as she tried to sleep, she thought she heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, circling the house once before fading away. Historians still debate whether Centralia's legends are just a product of isolation, a way for the remaining handful of residents to create meaning in a dying place. But Emily knew what she felt that night wasn't loneliness or imagination. It was attention, the kind that waits for you to make the first mistake. And that's why she obeyed the last law. Because in Centralia, answering might not just mean a conversation. It might mean you don't get the chance to have another one. And so, Emily's nights in Centralia settled into a quiet, deliberate rhythm. She closed her curtains before the last streak of daylight faded. She carried the flashlight, but never shone it toward the old playground. She kept her fires indoors, where the chimney could breathe without the ground pulling the smoke away. And most of all, she ignored any voice that spoke her name after the sun went down. The town seemed to respect her caution. The wind still carried whispers, but they passed by her door without pausing. The heat still rose from the ground, but it curled away before touching her porch. Even the shadows in the fog seemed to watch her from a distance, as though acknowledging she wasn't one to be tricked. She came to understand something that the laws had been trying to teach her all along. Survival here wasn't about courage or strength, it was about humility. About knowing you were a guest in a place that didn't belong to the living anymore. One evening, sitting by her window, Emily realized the town had grown strangely beautiful to her. The glow of the underground fire was soft, almost like candlelight under the earth. The silence felt like a blanket, thick and unbroken. She knew she could leave anytime, but she also knew she wouldn't, at least not yet. Because in obeying the laws, she had found a fragile peace, and in that peace was a truth she would carry forever. Some places don't need to shout to remind you who they are. They just wait for you to listen. So if you ever find yourself in Centralia after sunset, don't break the laws. And don't answer when the night knows your name.